My name is Dustin Kelly, but everybody calls me DJ. I'm prior Army, serving as both a Ford observer and a military police officer. I spent the last 14 and a half years as a police officer and detective in a large metropolitan police department. Two things that I've learned throughout my career. One, everybody has a story to tell. And two, the best stories are true. This is the DTD Podcast. In 3, 2, 1, and we're live. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the DTD Podcast. This week in the studio, a man who dedicated 20 years of his life to the U.S. Army, serving with the 10th Mountain Division and 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. He served as a squad leader, weapons squad leader, Batallion Air Operations Sergeant, Batallion Liaison Sergeant, Platoon Sergeant, and even First Sergeant. He's also led the 75th Ranger Regiment's pre-Ranger course. This guest was involved in the fiercest ground combat since the Vietnam War, when he was a member of the Ranger element that was involved in Operation Gothic Serpent in Mogadishu in October of 1993, better known as Black Hawk Down. It was then and there that my guest learned what it meant to truly lead when being in charge was thrust upon you and everything that could go wrong actually does. He is a public speaker, an author, and a mentor to countless soldiers. He's lived his entire life by being a great steward and public figure when it comes to representing the Ranger creed and the Warrior's ethos. Please welcome into the studio, Matt Eversman. What's going on, my friend?
Hey, DJ, thank you, man. That's like the nicest introduction anybody's ever given. I'll come on your show every day just to start off like that. But I mean that sincerely, man. Thank you for being so kind and for letting me come on this show. I mean, been snooping around at all of the 160 something
like that,
and it's quite a gallery of brigands and hoodlums.
Yeah, and the whole thing, and I think this kind of goes to your story too. I think for too long, these people's stories that need to be out there are not out there, and it needs to happen more often in a world that's surrounded with as much, if you want to call it bullshit or fake stories or whatever you want to call it. This is the time that we need to be hearing guys like you and guys like you that have been on the show and stories about what they've done.
I couldn't agree more. And again, that sounds like a canned answer when I'm like, I couldn't agree with you more, DJ. But I was just having a conversation with a guy, that I work with James Patterson. And, the whole idea was not to jump in about this book stuff. But, when you look at the books we've done together to date, it doesn't matter your politics. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle or your personal feelings or anything. I mean, we were talking about veterans, post 9/11 soldiers. We've talked about ER nurses. We've talked about policemen, and these are just unbelievable servants to our communities, and we should be able to get behind them and read their stories, or on your podcast and listen to these stories of incredibly brave men and women that, wouldn't allow us to do what we're doing tonight if it wasn't for them.
So let me ask you a question right off the bat. If it weren't for these stories, how do you think that would shape the United States going forward? If we didn't have these kind of stories, if we didn't have these kind of people that we could talk about, especially my wife was an ER nurse during COVID. I know that was a big part of your book with ER nurses. What would it be like going forward if we weren't able to tell these stories?
Yeah, well, it's a good commentary because there's a couple of things. First, I think we would be legitimately rudderless. We're a culture that needs heroes. And I don't mean that to be trite, but, we need people that inspire us. We need people that remind us of just the merits of this great republic in which we live. And so, right off the bat, I would just say, DJ, we need those to keep us straight, to give next generation leaders and warriors, something to aspire to. And I also think, historically, we need those. We need to know where we've come from, and it's on the path and on the backs of these men and women. And I don't want to get like so Dr. Phil-like, but the more I've done these worked with Jim on these books, from a historical perspective, it's like I listen to him. I think, man, if you didn't tell me this story, who would you have told it to? And if you didn't tell it, it would vanish, with when you're done. And so I don't mean to take up all the oxygen in the room, man, but we need to have them. And I don't mean that to be a weasel bookseller. I just say that, like, you look at all the divisiveness and all the stuff that we see every day, and you think, man, just shit. I need some semblance of order. I need something that makes me feel compelled to do something good, and that's what these stories, I think, they do. Much like, again, not to be Heckle and Jekyll, just like on all the guests on your podcast. I mean, what studs, unbelievable.
Yeah, and going a little further into it, talking about those stories, I like that you pointed out in some writings and stuff that you said that I'm not just going to call on my Ranger friends. I'm not just going to call on these guys in the special operations community. We need to hear everybody's story. And so when you talk about that, you talk about people that delivered fuel to outposts. You talked about people that were crew chiefs. You talked about nurses. You talked about all these different kinds of things, of stories that people might not think were important, but I've read about half of Walk in my combat boots, and it's amazing to just hear the stories of just people that you would look or you would think if you met them on the street, I have no idea about their history. And then you hear this story and it just unlocks a whole new world for you.
It does. And again, I said before, I'm like, well, we're not going to talk too much about James Patterson, but I do have to share, just as a sort of the lead into that commentary, DJ, is that, when I first met Jim, he just told me very matter of factly, it's like, Matt, everybody has a story. He's like, every single one of us, it doesn't matter who it is, guy on the street corner, clerk at the bank, doesn't matter, but everybody's got one story, maybe just one, that you would say, wow, I had no idea. And it might be a happy one, it might be a sad one, might be tragic, who knows, but it would be a story. And I say that as the lead in, and this from and I hate when people say that, so forgive me, but from your service time and your law enforcement time, and your spouse, your wife, who's an ER nurse, they all say, man, why are you talking to me? I haven't done anything. And then you talk to this young E4 truck driver that drove, 25,000 kilometers during 15 months during the surge and got blown up, a half a dozen times. And she's 23-year-old truck driver and keeps coming back for more. You're like, holy shit, that doesn't happen at Goldman Sachs. It doesn't. And where does a young woman like that come from? And it'll move you to tears, that service that we've been blessed to be able to highlight in these books. So yeah, no, I'm totally with you, 100%.
Let's talk about your history, your family history. Your father served in the military in the 50s. You had a sister that was an Army nurse. You had a brother that was a Marine Corps officer. So it's a wild history of yours that led, I know, to this service, but I think you tried to get around it at first. So let's talk about growing up and hearing your family and all of the service that they did and how that kind of led you ultimately to your decision.
Yeah, no, and it's in one sense, it's nothing spectacular. But on the other hand, as I look back on it now, I'm like, man, it's really pretty remarkable. And I say that not to pat myself on the back, but all the different directions it could have gone, but it didn't. And I'll just say this, I'm the youngest of four. My Marine Corps brother's 5 years older. My Merchant Marine brother's 8 years older. My sister, the Army nurse, 10 years older. And, I was sort of the wayward son, not a complete knucklehead, but partial knucklehead for sure. For some inexplicable reason, we all wanted to be a Marine. And I say that with love to our jarhead brethren. But, it was. It's like, it was just sort of something like, I'm going to go fly, I'm going to go be a jet pilot. I'm going to be a pilot in the Marine Corps. How they do it, I don't know. And, it was always a thing out there, DJ. It wasn't like I had this definitive list of things I'm going to do in my life, but it was like, I'll do that. And, I wound up going to college just because that sort of seemed like the next thing that you would do. And my siblings all did. My parents never pushed me one way or the other. And quite candidly, I mean, I like to joke about it now, but I just wasn't mature enough. I mean, I really wasn't mature enough. And to fast forward through this saga, they very mercifully, I treaded water for 3 years, and they mercifully put me out of my misery and told me to take a little sabbatical. And this was 1987. And for those of you all listening that are of that vintage, this is Cold War time. And I was home working at my parents had a little lumber yard in Natural Bridge, Virginia, no stoplight kind of town. I'm sitting there one day behind the counter, and in walks this kid that I'd gone to high school with. Hadn't seen him in 3 years, and hey, he looked pretty sharp. I mean, he was a little more put together than when we graduated. And as the story goes, I'm like, hey, how's school? Where are you in school now? And he's like, oh man, I left after a semester. I'm like, oh, what'd you do? He's like, I enlisted. I'm like, really? And he's like, yeah, man, I joined the Army, and I've been stationed in Berlin. And, that might as well have been the moon to me. I mean, I'd never been on an airplane before. So picture this, man. So Berlin's still divided. The wall's still up. He's talking about, being there when they're trading spies across the bridge. And he's telling me he's going to Yugoslavia on R&R, and he's doing live missions on the Czechoslovakian border. And I'm like, this is, where do I sign? This is like the coolest thing ever. And, listen, we want to go box up the Russians in the Fulda Gap in Germany. This is an easy sell for me. And, I just sort of had that revelation, like this is the times now. I really don't want to go to school. I think I need to go kind of test myself. That really, as I've looked back on it, not to be so deep, but that was probably the first real adult decision I made, was when I decided I'm not going to go back to school and, be miserable. I'm going to go try and do something. And with that, I think I'll be serving, kind of in the family footsteps. So yeah, that's what got me in.
Let me ask you though, and I ask a lot of guys this. You said you treaded water in college until, you got that phone call from the dean and all those kind of things that ask, maybe take a little time off. Do you think you were living to your full potential then? Or do you think you even knew your full potential back then?
Oh, wow. Good question. I would have to say I definitely had no idea about potential. I was just living in that moment. Like, it was just, I don't even know what I'm doing. I'm just going to school because I thought that was expected. And to my parents' credit, I think there was they were never slave drivers about it. And they always supported me 100% and then some. But, I've thought about it over the years, and DJ, and I'm like, the best thing I could have done for a guy at my maturity level then would have been to graduate from high school and get on the bus the next day and go, right to Fort Benning. Because I had no idea. And I don't want to beat myself up too much. We all get a little like that. But I look back and I think, my gosh, what was I thinking? I had no business. I was studying economics and French. That's what I was studying. And why? Because I took French in high school, and I figured, my dad was a businessman, so I should be a businessman. And that made sense to me, even though I didn't understand any of it literally at all. And, so to answer your question, to sum it all up, I don't think I was even close to even scratching the surface of potential. And I don't know how many 18-year-old boys that, really are anyway. Most of them probably aren't. I mean, shit, we should be probably chewing on erasers and eating glue in a mud puddle, when we're 18.
I think we can take that even a step further. So when you go to the recruiter and you talk and they try and get you into kind of a financial billet, they're like, hey, look, you took this in college, and you were like, look, if I was good at college, I wouldn't be here talking to you right now. And I that's what makes me think about your potential, though, because you fast forward just a couple of years into the military and you're far exceeding. I mean, you're moving up the ranks very fast. You're taking charge of things very quickly. But if you look at, on the flip of that coin to your college career, it's almost opposite ends of the spectrum. And so that's what I wonder about realizing your full potential, or if you needed this kind of kick in the pants to get that started and going.
Yeah, no, it really, in all honesty, and it is a great question because I've got a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old daughter in college who is the exact opposite. She can create her own structure with a lack of guidance from above, so to speak. I, however, not only needed the discipline, and I needed discipline in the individual way. I mean, I think my parents raised me to be respectful and have a good work ethic, generally speaking, and do that. But what I lacked and what I couldn't generate on my own was the regiment of the military. And actually, as soon as I got in, when they're like, "Hey, man, this is what hospital corners are," I'm like, "I know this. I can do that. Like, I can make a bed with the best of them." And it sounds silly. I know it does, but all those individual tasks that the drill sergeants, make you do, not that it's hard for anyone necessarily, but the regiment, you've got 5 minutes to do something, you got 10 minutes, all that stuff. I'm like, okay, you tell me, where the goalposts are. I can work within that. But if I don't have the parameters set up, man, I'm like, hey, squirrel, that kind of thing. And that's what I did in college. I look back on it, just as a quick aside, DJ, I look back, I listen, some of my greatest friends, and it wasn't like we were all out just getting banged up every night. Wonderful young men, and I had amazing professors. I went to a small private all male school in Virginia, and to this day, I owe them so much for my success. I tell it was my Sante raid. It was my greatest failure because I just it just never, the pieces never fit in. There was some variables that I couldn't do, but the military gave it to me just like that. And I do think I thrived, having that kind of structure, certainly at the beginning, and then as you mature in the military and you get off and, go from the conventional side to the special operations side, the parameters get a little wider and you realize, okay, I can sort of self-adjust and self-correct on that journey. And again, I don't mean to be so deep or sound so smart about it, but I would look you right in the eye and tell you that the structure of the military starting in basic training was the greatest gift I've been given. Well, one of them anyway.
When you get out, do you kind of go back to that squirrel mentality, or have you figured out how to kind of base your life around the schedules? Because you're a very busy man. You do a lot of public speaking, a lot of with the books that we've already kind of talked about. So you have very much deadlines and stuff now. Is that what keeps you down that straight and narrow, or have you figured out how to kind of set those parameters yourself?
Definitely the latter. I have figured out how to set those parameters as best I can. Not always perfect, but one of the biggest lessons I've learned since I retired in 2008 and got out to this big world that's been so frustrating is that time out here in the professional world is so arbitrary, and I mean that in the sense of people are late for meetings, people are late on phone calls, people set up meetings with no agenda, all these things that there's no structure, and it drives me batty. And so I find like, okay, I've got to still be Sergeant Eversman, and if they're not going to tell me, I've got to set up the parameters. I've got to set the goalposts, whatever analogy we use, because if I don't, it's going to come back and bite me. So I'm always trying to be ahead of the curve. And again, we can bombard you with all the military cliches, but it's amazing that anything ever gets done out here because so frequently, nobody really sets any kind of markers in the on the field, using that football analogy.
From what I've read, everything that I've read about you, everything that I've heard you speak on, when you go in, you go for the reason that a lot of the guys that go into special operations say they want to be at the tip of the spear. They want to do that kind of thing. But you start off with I would say, a very frustrating career. And I even heard that during that time in Mogadishu, that was your first time in combat, like your first time really pressed forward. So let's talk about you going in, your time at the 10th Mountain, and kind of, I would think, in everything that I've read, the frustration you felt after those first 4 years.
Yeah, and I gotta choose my words carefully because if somebody that hadn't served was listening, what I'm about to say is going to sound very condescending, and it is truly anything but. Um, you know, I had a database of zero when I joined the military. I came in an open contract. I said earlier, the way my career went, it could have gone a million. I could have gone to Korea right off the bat, but no, they decided that there was going to be this new thing called a cohort battalion. They were all going to go to drum, and so for me, once we got to Fort Drum, I'm like, this is awesome. We're light infantrymen. We're doing all the stuff that I thought soldiers would do, all on the idea. Again, we're still Cold War stuff. And after a couple of years, I was fortunate. I got to go to Ranger School, I got to SEER School, the Airborne School, Sniper School. Did an awful lot, because it was all there for the taking. And I was a little unrequited. Panama happened, Desert Storm happened, and we're still sitting in Watertown.
Well, let's not breeze over that so quickly. Panama happened while you were in Ranger School.
It did. It was the wildest thing. We had December, well, I guess on the 19th of December, we came back from Florida phase, because at the time you had Christmas Exodus. I was a Winter Ranger, and you go back to Benning and turn in all your stuff, and you got 2 week Exodus, which no matter what anybody says, it was awesome. Like having 2 weeks off was a really good, that worked. Being home for Christmas was cool. However, here we are just excited that we're going to go home and wake up the next morning, and the RTB commander calls us all out in a formation and announces the news that, at whatever it was, like 02 this morning, the regiment jumped into Panama. And you're like, this was like the moon landing. It was unbelievable. And all the kids from, Battalion were just heartbroken that they were, in school when this, first of, really the first big one for the regiment since Grenada. And I just remember watching these young guys, these Ranger buddies from Ranger School, who were devastated. And I'm like, I'm thinking about going home for Christmas. These guys are like, I want to get to Panama. Like, I want to go to the show. And several of them actually wound up going right back to 3rd Battalion and flew down, if not that night, like the next day, and follow-on ops. But that was the first thing where you realize, like, I myself clearly wasn't close to going to war, but there's now, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds that I know that are going to go from Ranger School to combat. And that's when I realized, I got to figure out how to get to this Ranger Battalion. That's the place I need to go.
Well, and, I talked to John Troxell a couple weeks ago, and he talked about when he jumped into Panama and he looked down and saw the Rangers already on the ground fighting as they were coming out of the planes. I mean, they really were the very, very tip of the spear on that. And so when I hear you talk about it, and when you say these guys were devastated, you weren't really yet, but you start figuring out, like, hey, this is what I want to do for a living. And then you start really wanting that kind of mission in your life, and you don't see it and you don't see it. And then it finally happens. Do sometimes you look back on it and go, man, you got to be careful what you wish for, because you can get it in a huge way if you're not careful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's so many commentaries about that very dynamic, DJ. And listen, perfect example. I want to go to the show. I want to go to war. I want to go to war because that's what we do. And I would just preface it by saying, we always will need really stout men and women that want to go and fight our enemies. But it's one thing to see it on the news, watching it after the fact. It's one thing, to in a peacetime, which it's hard to imagine where we are in 2023. But, at the time, you're kind of like, well, another 10 years till something happens. And, it really isn't that real. A small group of people went. But once you go, whether you've been shot at for 2 minutes or 2 hours or 20 hours or 20 days, it has I think, an effect on people. And I say that from the sense that, I didn't anyway. Shouldn't say broad you. I mean, I realized after going to Mogadishu and coming back, it was very scary. The reality of war is very ugly. It just is. Nobody, watching your, one of your soldiers or teammates get killed or wounded is horrible. There's no preparation for that. You can't test your emotions to know what it's like when you hold somebody dying in your lap. But the greater piece for me was, man, I made some mistakes, and I learned a lot of lessons that I can still pass on. And I know it sounds awfully self-righteous, but at the time that was it. It's like, you know what? I was so to back up for a second. When I got to 375 in early the spring of 1992, they were all filled with Panama veterans. I mean, everybody had a mustard stain on their wings. They had a combat scroll and a CIB, and there was brand new Staff Sergeant Eversman, promoted literally in the parking lot, pinned on my rank, before I signed in, and I'm surrounded by all this combat experience, and nobody ever told me what it was like. Truly, nobody, and I was too intimidated to ask, but no one ever told me what it was like. And after Mogadishu, I'm like, I'll never let that happen again, to anyone that's around me. If they want to know, I'm going to tell them. And if they don't want to know, I'm still going to tell them, because, that's a big thing, at least for me, for a young man or a young woman, 20 something, dealing with mortality. And, again, I've had 30 years to think about it in a little deeper terms, but, nobody ever really, we talk about it in the sense like, yeah, guys die on the battlefield and all that stuff. And you're like, yeah, because it's part of a training exercise, but you really don't know what it's like until you experience it. And that takes all this sexy, cool shit that you do and puts that on the back burner, because that is, now we're talking about the question about battle. And that's a tough one. And I think that, if I can trudge through the answer a little more, DJ, it's just, that was a greater thing to me. Like, we gotta make sure we learn these lessons, because we're going to go again, and it could be tomorrow. It absolutely could be tomorrow. And whether you're a tanker or, in a ADA or whatever, it doesn't matter. Combat Service Support Unit, doesn't matter. We could go tomorrow. In fact, as we're talking right now, they could be ramping up somewhere to go someplace in 18 hours. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, doesn't matter. We're at harm's way just by the state of the world today. And, these young guys and gals got to remember, there's not a timeout. We're going to go again, and you got to be ready.
So let's tack on a little more to that answer, because I think it's a great answer that you gave, but I think it goes even a little deeper. You said you had all these guys there with the mustard stain on, the combat scroll, the CIB, all of these things. You're an E6. You come in. There's E2s and E3s and E4s that have experienced combat, have been to the game already, the big game, actually. And you're coming in and you've got to lead these guys. Yeah, you've got a lot of schools, you've got a lot of experience behind you, but you don't have the experience they do. How do you bridge that gap? Because especially in somewhere like that with the alpha males that are around, that has to be a very precarious situation to insert yourself into.
It is, and I don't mean that patting myself on the back. It's true in any unit, in any branch, anywhere. The new guy coming in is always going to be tested. The new guy coming into a unit like that with that much experience is really going to be tested. It can be awfully lonely and all that stuff. But the thing about the Ranger Regiment, and it's, I joke about the Ranger infomercial when we have questions like this, but it's a testament, I think, to, at least when I was there and at that particular time, the professionalism. And yeah, they're looking and they're sizing you up. So you better be able to deliver. You better be able to deliver daily, at your job. And that means, you better, your uniform better be sharp, your boots better be sharp, you better be in shape, you better be able to be at the front of the line in everything you do. And most importantly, man, you got to be a professional. You have to. No one can argue with professionalism. And I'm not talking about everybody that's AR or doctrinally knows everything by the book to the nth degree, but generally speaking, you got to know what's right, and you got to be able to deliver. I tell this to young West Pointers and midshipmen all the time. I'm like, when you show up at your unit as a new lieutenant, a new ensign, they know what you don't know. So first of all, you better have a good handshake. You better look them in the eye. and you better be confident, and you doggone well better be able to smoke the shit out of somebody in PT, because that's what we judge people on, no matter what. That's what we're looking at. So right off the bat, for me, and I was just telling a buddy of mine from the 10th Mountain the other day, I said, the thing we did really well at the 10th Mountain Division, amongst a lot of other things, but we walked a lot. We road marched a lot. We humped out to the woods a lot. It's a brand new private, and yeah, it's a conventional light infantry. But when I get down to 375, I can say one thing I could do very, very well, and it kind of surprised me compared to the rest, was that I could carry a big rucksack and I could walk a long way at a good clip, and I'll never fall out. I think when people, that was sort of my saving grace of one example, when people are like, hey, this Eversman guy can hang. And also by the end of the, at the end of the road march, he can still do his job. And people realize that, hey, this guy's he's not resting on anything. He's not mailing it in. He can do it. And listen, you talk about leadership skills, and, we're all learning as we go, but, being professional and treating people well is, man, if you don't do that right off the bat, you're screwed.
Full transparency. You talked about what you were good at when you got there. What'd you fail at?
Oh, man, shit. The list is long and distinguished, DJ. So I was really good at road marching, but, I'm 6'4". My arms are like, 4 feet tall. Chin-ups I sucked at, so there's some physical fitness things that were just brutal. And quite candidly, despite what I just said, I didn't know the squad battle drills. I knew what my leaders up at Fort Drum had showed me, so it was sort of, route memory things, but I really didn't know the science behind or the art of being an infantryman. And when I got to the regiment, what I learned in a hurry was, they expect you're not just there marking time, you are there to learn and demonstrate your proficiency, and it better be above the standard. You're allowed to make mistakes, but you better fix them in a hurry. So that, literally, I would go home to my apartment and I would read the manuals. Not because I wanted to, quite honestly, but because I had to. Like, you better know the basic infantry drill, the squad drills. You better know the battle drills inside and out, so that if somebody ever calls you out and says, well, this is the way we've always done it, you can say, well, no, actually, that's not the way. We've got to do it by this doctrine first. And once we get that down, then we can start to, again, open up the parameters and figure out where we can adjust to the situations. But that's really, really hard. And I think that boils down to a difference in standards. Quite candidly, it's a different in standards. And when you're in one unit, maybe the standards aren't always enforced as they should, and then you get to a unit where they're not only higher, but they're enforced at a higher standard. You got people nipping at your heels morning, noon, and night, because listen, they'll get another staff sergeant, tomorrow. They'll get another lieutenant. They'll get another captain. There's no shortage of people that want to come to the Ranger Regiment. So you better be delivering at a high standard, and that was a lesson. That was a great lesson to learn. Thankfully, I think one that I did. But pretty soon, as you get into that groove and you're learning the skill and learning your trade, learning this profession, pretty soon people forget about what's on your shoulder, and they're just looking at you as the teammate and the peer and the leader. And then you sort of grow as a team.
What's more important, the big things or the little things? And what I say in two different situations, in garrison and in combat.
Yeah, that's a great one, because, the easy answer is they both matter. The blocking, tackling, and whatever cliches we use. But I would probably say, it's the little things. You can learn support by fire. We put the machine guns on one side, and they're gonna light up the target, and then the assault element's gonna go, and they're gonna shift fire, and we're gonna move through. That's a big thing, and that's really not that hard a concept to find. But if you're in that support by fire position, knowing about, the beaten zones and the rates of fire and all those kind of nuanced piece, the art of machine gunnery, that's dramatically important. And I'll even drill it down further, and Dave Grange was the regimental commander there. He was an amazing, legendary, iconic, just like his dad was, Ranger. And he would always drill. He's like, you know what? Anyone can change the magazine in their weapon on a live fire. He's like, you can change a weapon and do sports and all that kind of immediate action shit. But, if you can do it in the day, you got to be able to do it at night. If you can do it in the sun, you got to do it in the rain. If you can do it, in the dryness, you got to be able to do it in a mud puddle. And it sounds so silly. And you're like, yeah, of course. But, when the pressure's on, ramping up the variables that add to the complexity, because that's what's going to happen in combat, and I realized that I had a moment on October 3rd where, during the middle of a firefight, DJ, I'm like, just had that, wow, that's why we did what we did, like in Thailand, or that's why we did this stuff. So yeah, I would, we could go on all night, but I think the little, I would probably go, my vote is on the little things. You got to be able to do the little things, because the little things are what's going to trip you up. And man, if you can't put the primer on your det cord, when your heart rate's going, to blow the, to breach a door, what good are you? We know the big thing, you got to breach a door, but you don't know how to do it. The little stuff, man, you're screwed.
And so you're going to use that both in garrison and in combat. You would say the little things tied over for both of those.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, and I've said this to a bunch of folks that are probably bored of hearing it, but if you can't relate, your tasks in garrison to our combat focused somehow, and maybe some of it's a little bit, you gotta be a little theatrical sometimes, but if you can't explain to somebody why you got to buff the floor to a high standard, then why are we doing it other than just to look good? Well, it's discipline. It's self-discipline. It is improving the position, so to speak. Whatever you can do something else. Do one more thing. And I'm purposely using that as an example. Kids are like, why the fuck do I gotta like buff the floor in the barracks at night in these old, dilapidated barracks? It's like, well, one, you live there, and you deserve to live in a nice spot. But two, you need to have that discipline to make it better. And okay is not good enough. It just isn't. It never is. I've heard people out here in the civilian professional world say a lot of times they work for a guy. He's like, don't let excellence get in the way of good enough. And I'm like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Like, that's the stupidest. Okay is good enough. And I'm like, no. And this was a successful guy. I'm like, well, if that's true, think how much better it would be if if the standard were higher. If we did one more thing. So yeah, the little things, and you got to do it. And listen, nobody. Well, that's not true. There are plenty of people that love being in garrison because it's not hard. It's easy, and you get to be a show pony. Being good in garrison should be commensurate to being good in the field. It's like people that always say like, oh, well, that guy's an asshole, but he's really good. He's a really good at fill in the blank task. It's like, yeah, but he's still an asshole. And who wants to work for an asshole? I mean, like that doesn't build the right atmosphere. Because man, when you got to send a couple of kids down the alley, who would they rather do it for? Somebody they trust and are inspired by and enjoy working with, or the guy that they're like, man, this guy sucks. I hate him. With a passion, like with a deadly passion, because he's just a tool. I mean, I think you really got to be a total player.
I'm glad you said that, because I want to tack on a little more to that question. I've had a lot of guys on here say both ways. A lot of guys say they explain why we have to eat a shit sandwich, because when you explain it and you get your guys to do it, after a while, when the shit hits the fan, you don't have to explain why you're eating a shit sandwich. You're just doing it. You're commanding to go there. And then I've heard other guys say that you shouldn't take all that time, that you should just get the job done. A simple thing like buffing the floor, that should be a given. This is where you live. This is how you take pride in what you wear and what you live and where you live. What's your fall on that? Because I want to get into that other trustworthy thing when you're talking about sending those guys down the alleyway. But what do you feel like about telling someone this is why you're eating this shit sandwich?
Yeah, no, and I'll tell you, this was one I did a 180 on, because at first I'm like, what the fuck, man? Why don't you know how to do this? Why is this, a foreign language to you that, when I just say at the end of the day, buff the floors and I better come back tomorrow and, you look at it and you're like, wow, it's really not buffed very well. And after a while, you realize, well, quite candidly, sometimes, these kids, these young men and women have never been shown. Like no one's ever taken it that simple. Like no one's ever shown them exactly what the standard is. Now, I would tell you, DJ, because it's a great question, and I've had it a lot with young leaders as they're developing, and I'm like, there just won't be the time that you can explain it to everybody. You won't. I mean, it's impossible, and especially on the battlefield. But what I would tell, and I use this learned it when I was a squad leader and took it through the rest of my career. It's like, you know what? I'll give everybody the benefit of the doubt once. You know what? We've got to make sure that they understand, whether it's the actions of, again, not to overuse the whole buffing the floor thing, but whether we're talking about, this particular operation that we got to do, but maybe even more so explaining to a kid who doesn't really understand what loyalty or trustworthiness or some of their values really is. And it seems foreign in one sense, but listen, I grew up in a good, happy family. Mom, dad, 3 older brothers and sisters, loving, supporting household, everything. I came into the service, and there were a lot of kids that weren't from that same background. And they weren't, and they were good kids. And I say kids with just respect to age. They really didn't know any better. And so if you don't explain to that young guy or gal, why trustworthiness or loyalty or fill in the blank value is important, man, how are you going to expect them on the battlefield when the Murphy's Law is there and the helicopter's down and another one's gone down, that, you've got to, do A, B, and C because I told you to. Man, if that's not the place to be teaching that. So I kind of revert back to, you got to show everybody once. You can't expect a 19-year-old kid to take it on his own right off the gate to learn how to daisy chain a claymore mine, during the an hour deployment sequence. Like if you haven't taught him before that, and you're expecting that he stayed up at night, watching David Letterman, looking at the manual. It's like, no, dude, man, wrong. Like you better show him. I revert back to that part, DJ. Is like, we got to show everybody at least once, and sometimes maybe only once, but we got to show them all, because if you expect and you make an assumption, it's gonna backfire, and it's gonna backfire at the worst time. So that's my 2 cents. And yeah, and listen, the logic on sort of the other side, it makes perfect sense. It really does. It's like, dude, I shouldn't have to tell you, this, that, and the other. It's like, no, I'm not in my head, not in a roundabout way. I'm like, no, you shouldn't. But if you didn't, and nobody before you did, how's this kid ever going to learn?
The only thing I fear from that is that sometimes you get into a situation where you have to over-explain because people become dependent on that explanation. And so I fear that there's a possibility of going down that road where you're having to explain everything when you shouldn't have to, and you're wasting time that could be better spent somewhere else.
Absolutely. And absolutely no doubt in my mind. I mean, you're right on. And that kind of brings up to you, young squad leader, young staff sergeant Eversman, better be prepared. You better be thinking a little more about, like, hey, I've been telling DJ, I've showed him this like 3 times, 4. Now it's another time. I got to tell him, man, be out 5 minutes early. If he's not getting it, we got to know when that trigger line is. It's like, man, love you, but it's not working. And there's not, I don't think, an empirical answer. When is that? If you tell them once, some kids only, it's like, this, and I hate, again, apologize when people say, this, but, the fascinating thing that I learned as I was growing up as a young leader was there are some kids that only understand if you curse. Like truly, if you don't drop an F-bomb, they don't know you're serious. And there are other kids, all you got to do is just look at them and they know. They're like, oh yeah, man, I'm on it. And like, everybody's a little bit different, but it's a good point. And I'm not saying that to be a weasel. I don't have an answer on when do you know that you're just wasting time and spinning your wheels. And I think probably I had experiences where a commander or a first sergeant's like, all right, man, I love you for trying, Eversman, but, it ain't working. Or, dude, you're supposed to be out doing something, 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, an hour ago, and you're still here, bullshitting around with this kid trying to square his ruck away. It's like, no, man, we don't have time for that. So maybe a little bit of push me, pull you where you learn. And I don't know, but I think I would, my answer at the end of the Jeopardy round is I still go by kids probably haven't been shown everything, you know, to standard always, and again, I hate to beat up on the NCO Corps or anything, but I think sometimes guys are like, oh well, I did it like that, I figured it out, you should be too. It's like, yeah, but they don't, they just don't. If they did, it would all be easy. You'd learn everything in basic training and ready to go.
Before we get into Mogadishu, if you guys go on kind of a world tour, you're training all over the place. I would like to understand, what's the biggest thing you took away from that? All of this training, all of this moving around, these rapid deployments everywhere you're going. What's the biggest thing you took into Mogadishu with you from that?
Yeah, so I would sum it back up to I talked about David Grange, Colonel Grange, who was the pardon me, the regimental commander, about the whole changing magazines. If you do it a day, you got to do it at night. This took it to the next level. This was you better be able to do it in the jungle. You better be able to do it in the mountains. You better be able to do this in every environment we can possibly throw at you. I mean, because you never know where we're going to have to go fight. And, it's hard and it's exhausting. And all the travel, which on one hand, you're like, man, this is cool. We're going to Thailand. We're going to Korea. We're going to Egypt, we're going to Panama, all these things. But man, you get to that place and you got to deliver, constantly. You tired and hungry and all that shit. You've got to be able to do it. And I think that builds up that builds up the muscle memory. It builds up your instincts, so that when you get in an environment like Mogadishu, which quite candidly, I mean, I'd never trained in a environment just like Mogadishu, but kind of close, kind of similar, really hot and everything. But I think, at the time you think, oh, we're going on a cool boondoggle to Germany or someplace like that. It's like, no, there's a reason, why those commands figured it out. I had a guy like again, I don't mean to keep going back to David Grange, but this Ranger Regiment better be able to operate everywhere. And if we can't, then what are we doing?
And that's what I was going to ask you next was, how ready were you for Mogadishu? How ready was the regiment for Mogadishu? Because you had trained in similar situations, not exactly like it. But your personal opinion, how ready were you guys for that situation?
You look back and you think, oh man, you're never as ready as you could be. And there's all this stuff we should have done or could have done and we didn't. And oh man, we weren't quite as ready. But in reality, listen, I think that we were absolutely as prepared as we could possibly have been. Listen, we get into, what did we do wrong and what are the mistakes that we made and lessons learned of things like, going on a deployment when you're on your alert cycle with all of your shit still at Fort Benning, bad idea. Like that's not a really great thing to deploy people with all their gear, all their mission deployment stuff and their connexes back at home station, like kind of a bigger picture thing, but it's to that point, command level, support level, all these things that we didn't do right. But at the soldier level, I think, listen, this now became this is a little bit of movement to contact. This is a little bit of patrolling. There's a little bit of all the things that we had, the infantry skills that we had done, I think, very, very well. But listen, at the end of the day, DJ, nothing can completely prepare. And when I say you, I'm really just talking about me. I couldn't speak for anybody else, but for me, nothing can quite get to that reaction of, hey, this isn't just I hear gunfire, because we've done that all our careers. This is like someone's got me in their sights. Like that sixth sense is like that's happening, and that's just one of those, man. You hope that all the training will boost you through that moment of of reality, so to speak. And again, just for me, but what I saw, and we joked. Tom DiDamaso was our PL in Second Platoon, and sometime, probably in September, probably about this time of the year, 30 years ago, I remember he was talking about SLA Marshall and the whole, theory of how only 25% of the guys under fire, I think that was the number, I don't recall exactly, would actually go from safe to semi, when they got in a gunfight. And I'm like, you're bullshit, sir. You're kidding me. And, what we found was, no, actually 100% of the guys on a really short runway, a short run, once this happened, it was, move to the sound of gunfire and execute. There was no, okay, now, let's sort of, now it's time to shoot. Like, guys did it. 20-year-olds did that. And that was another one of those moments on the battlefield where I'm like, okay, that's why we do this stuff. This gets us through that emotional piece of, man, they're shooting at me, and that's kind of unnatural. But it's a phenomenal, it's a fantastic exercise, I think, in maybe the psychology or whatever, the behavioral piece of it that smarter people than me know. But all I can go back to, my experience was, and I can only go back to our training, back to this all around the world training and the high standards and the discipline. When that all comes together at that moment where you gotta pull the trigger, it happened. And I never saw anybody not do it. And that was my experience, and that's sort of the story I'm going with.
Well, and I've even heard you talk about when Blackburn comes out of the helicopter and falls, that you would have had 100% of people returning fire if they weren't working, trying to get other things set up, that you noticed that right from the start of it. So I think that holds true in what you're saying, because you said you saw it firsthand experience of everyone around you doing that. A big thing to me is, I know you've talked this story to death. I want to try and approach it from a little different angle with you. It's what I try and do with the guests on the show, because I know even with what we're talking about, sometimes you get tired of talking about it. Sometimes you don't want to. So I want to talk about August 26, 1993. You land Horn of Africa. You wrote about the acrid smell in the air, about how it looked. If we can, for the listeners, can we kind of tap back into that? The sights, the smells. This is what you've been wanting your whole career. It got delivered in a huge package to you. Let's talk about when you touched down at that small runway, and now you're there and you're in the big game.
Yeah, man. Wow. It's funny, and maybe it's haha funny. And just back up just before that, maybe it was the 25th or so, leaving, when we finally got palletized and we're leaving, and, I'm nervous and thinking about all that. But, there was this excitement too about what's coming, and it's a great unknown. Like, I have no idea. And Mike Durant had said, and maybe you'd read this before, he made a comment, after the fact. He's like, I was leaving, looking out the airplane window thinking like, oh, I'll never see the green grass of North Carolina again. And I'm thinking, I'm just worried about what's going to happen, when we get off, when they crack the ramp of that C5 or whatever, when we get to Mogadishu, and, are the Mongolian horde going to be there to meet us? And, what we found, we landed on the runway, and it wasn't like we all ran off, and set up a fighting position. We, as I recall, we just kind of got out, and maybe we walked a little bit faster and moved to our staging area, by the hangar, and kind of figured shit out. But it wasn't like, hey, you're doing a jump into Panama or Grenada. It totally was. It was a little anticlimactic. However, that first night, we took mortar fire.
I heard there were guys cheering.
They were cheering. I was like, holy shit, man. Like, these, you're sitting there in this great the biggest building in Mogadishu, this big aluminum airplane hangar, and you're thinking, a 60 millimeter round lands on the roof and it's curtains. Like, we're done. That's going to be an ugly day. And we'd run out there. It's like some, they had some old cement, I don't know, some kind of big cement structures that were around the airfield, and that was where you'd run like a clamshell, and you'd get all your shit, you'd run in there and wait for the mortars to end. And, that had happened, every day. And you're like, after, the first time, everybody was like cheering, like it's the mortars. I'm thinking, man, this is, I'm not cheering, but wow, these guys are unfazed, like truly. And it wasn't just the Delta guys. It was Ranger young guys were like, man, we're here. Let's go get it on. And that, again, as silly as that sounds in one sense, it was very reassuring for me knowing that, man, I'm around guys that they're not afraid. They're literally not afraid of anything, and that psychologically, I think, was a big help too. Knowing, hey, man, well, we're here. We're in battle. We're going to go out, and it was a couple of days before General Garrison pulled the first mission for us to go out and do. And, it was, I don't know, listen, there's a lot of theories about things. I don't know whether it was just to sort of get the monkey off your back or whether it was a real mission. I think it was a real mission. I don't think he'd play around with soldiers' lives, but, we went and we found a mission and target and we went out and did it. And that was like euphoria. Like, shit, man, we just went and did it. It wasn't perfect, make mistakes, but you kind of realize too that nothing's ever going to be perfect, on the battlefield.
What's your thoughts of you as a leader before combat? You're in Mogadishu, but what are your thoughts as you as a leader? Now, you've already talked about all the guys around you. Hey, these guys are fearless. How are you think you're handling it?
I hope I was doing it right. I had the luxury, DJ, and I truly mean that as a luxury. The way we were organized, for the Rangers and the blocking forces, we had 4 Black Hawks of Rangers, 2 platoons split amongst two helicopters, and my platoon sergeant Chris Hardy was the chalk leader, and my job as it's kind of the APL, the assistant patrol leader. So I had a great, an unbelievable leader, truly in charge of our aircraft. And that allowed me the opportunity, one, to watch him, monkey see, monkey do. But 2, I could focus on what does Chris Hardy need me to do? Whatever he needs me to do, I can do. And that, it's like being a jump master. I never felt, I never liked jumping, to be quite candid. In fact, I hated it. And if I never fall out of an airplane again, that'll be fine. But when you're a jump master, when I became a jump master, all of a sudden it's like I never didn't mind it at all, because I focused on, really important stuff, but no worry about, is my chute going to open and jumping and all that kind of shit. And it was kind of the same thing being the APL. It's like, yeah, it's scary going out of the wire, but, Chris Hardy's in charge and I'm got to, I can just focus on doing what he needs me to do. And that trickles down to all the rest of the Rangers. I don't know if that, in my mind, that makes sense, but.
No, I think it does, but I think it goes further in your story that Chris Hardy's not there when actually the 7th mission goes down with a Red Cross message going back to the United States. Was Chris, he was a Panama veteran, correct?
No, interestingly enough, that, and I hate to say like that poor guy, he was PCSing from 2nd Ranger Battalion to back to Fort Benning. I think he was going to go to RHQ. Literally, he had just signed out like a couple of days before, and if I recall, he was like somewhere, in Oklahoma when when he heard about the jump. And oh man, you're just like brutal, for a guy who has been so successful as a leader that missed it through no fault of his own. But listen, I could go I could talk all night about Chris Hardy because he went on to be
Command Sergeant Major, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he was El Jefe and led them multiple times on multiple deployments, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he made up for it then. But certainly he those first couple of missions, he was amazing. He was a great mentor, great leader, and I think that really helped me sort of get my feet above the ground. Which ultimately on October 3rd, it's like, hey man, there's no thinking about this, just do it.
I want to compare and contrast kind of the movie and the true story of you. In the movie, Josh Hartnett plays you, which I got to tell you, I can see the resemblance there.
Clearly. I mean, it's It's scary. It's scandalous. How good looking I am.
Right. All right. They they present him in the movie as a thinking man that kind of explains things when everyone's talking about who they're fighting, what's going on in Mogadishu, the warlords. They present him as a very, I would almost say, philosophical guy. Would you agree with that portrayal of him?
Yeah, no, Sergeant Eversman in the movie is definitely, very introspective, deep thinker for a young guy about worldly things and the politics that are going on and all that. And cut to the chase and say, I never thought about any of that stuff at all. Literally nothing. Um, and that'll come back. That'll actually come back to haunt me later in my career, in a sense, because you realize I know shit about Somalia. I didn't know anything. I literally knew nothing. I knew nothing about the politics. I knew nothing, about what had gotten us into Somalia. I mean, as far as I knew, that was just a UN mission. I knew nothing about the history. I knew nothing about, why the Russians, like Somalia and why the Italians like the Russians and all this kind of stuff. Like, to me, it's just like, man, we're just going to go, put heads to bed. That's what we do. This is a deed's a bad guy. He needs to be caught, captured or killed, whatever's going to happen that day. But I never thought about any of the other stuff, and that's kind of risky too. But yeah, in the movie Hartnett, he's got these great thoughts about Somalia and watching it on CNN or whatever they say, and to me it was just like, man, let's just go and do this thing and be done. I thought honestly, DJ, that we'd be done in a week. I thought we're going to fly all the way over here. We're going to get the whole gang assembled. We're going to go out and roll this guy up and we'll be home next week. Like I truly, when we first got there, I thought this mission was going to be, one and done. And I'm embarrassed to say that, but that's true. That's exactly what I thought.
Okay, so let's take that a little further then. Say you do know the politics. Say you do know what's going on. Do you think, and maybe you can't answer this question, do you think that you change your thoughts on that? Do you think it changes and you go, man, this isn't going to be a weak thing. This is pretty spider webbed over here. We might be here a little longer than we think.
Probably, but I don't think it would affect, the mission focus. And I say that, doing the infantry battle drill where we need to do it is I think universal. What I didn't expect, again, quite candidly, was there's a bunch of ragtag, sub-Saharan African thugs with AKs that are stoned out of their gourd all the time. I mean, how hard can that be? Truly, how hard can that be? I mean, of course, we'll go, we'll go roll these guys up and that'll be that. And you realize very quickly that, reality of combat is that, a 15-year-old kid that takes a pot shot, across the fence line can kill you, our greatest, Ranger, Delta operator, doesn't matter, just as dead as, whatever, a Spetsnaz guy, and so that was a rude awakening, like this enemy is formidable. I learned afterwards that, Kofor Black, who was the ambassador of counterterrorism, I met him a couple of years after we got back from Mogadishu, and he said, Matt, there are three things historically, because he lived in Mogadishu. As a CIA officer, he'd been in Mogadishu. He said, Matt, there's three things that Somali men do. He's like, they chase Somali women, they like to get high, and they like to fight. That's it. That's the only thing. Those are the three things that's what they're born into. And oh, by the way, unlike Westerners, the Somalis that have been in civil war forever, they want to go see what the fuck's going on when a mortar round drops in their neighborhood. They move to danger, as a civilian population, as opposed to, Westerners that were like, oh shit, man, let's get away. And like, I had no idea about that. That was the weirdest thing. Like, you're in the middle of a fire to fight and there's families basically out there watching. Just, they don't mean you harm. They're just watching. And you're like, wait, that wasn't in the playbook. Nobody told me that before. So kind of things like that, I didn't know. I don't know that would have necessarily changed our ability or my ability to to act on the battlefield. But it might have been, good to know that, hey, just to add a little complication to this, Matt, when you're out there on that blocking position, for Chalk 4, there's going to be a lot of rubberneckers. Even though you're going to be in a big fight, there are going to be rubberneckers, and you're going to have to just deal with that. And like that was crazy. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but there's a lot of stuff that was weird. It was just surreal.
I think another big factor that we haven't really mentioned is number. The size of the element that you were fighting. When you say these guys were high and they take pop shots, and they're just looking for a fight and things, I think if you go drill a little deeper into it, I think there was estimates up to 5,000 armed Somalis that day.
The word I got afterwards was 10,000 armed Somalis that day. Who knows what, but whether it's, 500, 5,000, or 10,000, I mean, there's only 150 trigger pullers on the ground, vastly outnumbered.
Right.
I mean, truly, it's like, whoa, holy shit, I had no idea.
And so when you factor that in too, I think you're looking at something that, we talked about it at the very beginning of the show. I mean, it was some of the most dangerous fighting since Vietnam, since the offensives were happening. A thing about that day, we talked about Chris being moved out, you taking over. You've got new soldiers, you've got guys that have been in combat that are working with you. How do you get ready for everything that's getting ready to happen? Because up until that day, you had done 6 combat missions in Mogadishu. How are you getting ready for that mission where you're actually going to roll the guy up?
Yeah, and I will say it's the beauty, I believe, of the training. So if I separate kind of half my brain on one side and half on the other, the rehearsal and knowing the battle drill and making sure everybody understands and remembers their piece of the puzzle, it's one thing. Very, very mathematical. Like here's what everybody's got to do. Reminder: we've all done it before. Let's do it again, and all that kind of stuff. It becomes again this instinctive muscle memory, how the blocking position will be established. The other side of my brain, there's a fear factor, at least for me, because after that first time you realize like, no, these guys are here to fight. Like these Somalis are gonna fight, and every time you leave the wire, someone is going to try and kill you, and or at least be prepared that someone's going to try and kill you. And so there's that emotional side, I guess, of it, and how everybody reconciles that is probably a little bit different. And just remembering for me, I got a lot of strength, in real time, just because the men across the board, not just my chalk, but the guys were just undaunted. And I'm like, okay, if they're doing that, I gotta, even if I'm nervous about getting shot at, I gotta still do it. And I think that's, once I realized like that's okay, it's okay for me, as a man to be like, yeah, I hope it doesn't hurt, like that kind of idea of like, shit, man, these guys are gonna fight. But I can tell you that my experience was once you got to that helicopter and once it started to take off and, all of a sudden you're focused again, like that jump master example, you sort of, your mind is takes another focus on, the immediate stuff that's going on for this battle and this mission. And then you can come back after the mission and sort of digest everything that happened. So there's that little lead up and then you go, I guess it's the same thing as, when you're getting ready for a game, overused sports analogies, but, once you get going, you trust in your training and trust in your men, and we'll just go out there and do it together.
All right. You've said before that most soldiers live with one question all the days that they're in uniform, and they want to know how they'll react when the bullets start flying. So I want you to keep that quote in mind. Let's kind of set it up as you go in your blocking position 4. You are the last bird in the entire one to offload, correct?
That is correct.
19 helicopters, you're the last one. As you come in, shit hits the fan. Murphy's Law presents itself right off the bat. We don't need to get into the details of that. What I want to talk about is, as this comes in, you already have a fear factor going. It's a natural thing with people going into harm's way. When this happens and you have to get your brain screwed on correctly, how fast is everything moving for you once the initial fall happens? And how do you compose yourself, get yourself back together, and get your group ready to move?
Yeah, and listen, I've been thinking about that for 30 years, and I've tried to tell soldiers and rangers afterwards, and 10th Mountain guys afterwards, and young cadets afterwards. And I think first, again, broken record, it goes back to training. But you just get kind of caught up in the moment, but in a good way. It's all just like, so. For instance, when the helicopter comes to a hover, and we're fucking around with the ropes, and we're in the wrong spot, and we get the ropes down, and pilot's telling me, Matt, we're in the wrong spot. And when you get on the ground, go in the direction of flight a couple of blocks, and you'll be all right. And you might know this. My iPro broke, as I'm getting ready to go. So here I am, getting ready to grab the rope, and I don't have any eye protection in this big sandstorm. And I remember, like, fuck, I just got to go. Like, what, you're going to stay on the aircraft? No, like you just something moves you to keep going. And then as soon as I eventually got on the ground, in a good way, things just started happening. And when I say things started happening, I realize, all these problems are mine, and I'm a little vapor locked on it. But I realize, the men are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, and they've done it without me giving any, commands, so to speak. The boys are fighting back at the enemy, and, it's sort of just slow motion for a little bit. I don't know how long it was. I've asked guys, like, man, I felt like I was standing in the middle of that intersection trying to figure out what the fuck's going on with Blackburn and no comms and the firefight and the wrong spot and all that stuff, but probably wasn't that long in reality. And it just happened. And I realized, like, hey, man, make a decision. Just make a decision. And this one all of a sudden became very crystal clear and very obvious. Like, we got to do a CASEVAC, and we're going to have to do it by foot. And we've done it before. We've done it a million times in training. And so that kind of, I think once that decision made, everything else was, I hate to say, DJ, like, oh, it was all easy, because listen, there are moments, but, it just sort of, happened very instinctively. But listen, the greatest example I can tell you, though, I remember sitting there and during all of this going on and feeling like, man, I'm starting to lose control myself. Sergeant Eversman, I remember thinking, like, fuck, man, I got to do something. And I'm trying to, my mind's wandering on all the things, all the problems to solve. And I looked at the boys, and I must admit, I'm like, look at these brave dudes. Like, they're getting after it, and I'm holding up progress. And I say that, and it just sort of hit me like, okay, do this, make this decision. And again, that delta of time, who knows? And afterwards, I remember when we got back to the airfield, whether it was the next day or some days later, I remember asking one of the younger guys on my squad, I said, man, because after you go through an experience like that, you can kind of take your rank off, and talk very candidly. And I remember saying to this guy, and I'm like, hey, Dave, I got to tell you, man, that was some scary shit. And that was, I was really kind of, flummoxed right there. And I remember him saying, it's like, Sergeant Eversman, I was looking at you, and you were standing up in the middle of this intersection and doing your stuff. And he's like, man, that guy's brave. I better do my job. So there's this kind of symbiotic relationship. They're looking at you as a leader, for guidance and direction and purpose and all that stuff. But they're looking to see that you're not losing your cool. And you, at least me as a leader, I was like, these dudes they're unfazed by all this shit. So let's just, right off of that. And it really did. It was remarkable to me all these years later. I just keep saying, man, the young E3s were giving me strength to do my thing. And, it does also happen, DJ, that, once you kind of get going, it really did. And I know I'm keep going back like, oh, it's this training and the instinct and muscle memory. There was no time to really stop and think. It's just like, go. Like, you got to just keep solving problems, as they come up. And a lot of them come up, and you just do what is, basically natural. And for us, I think, those were the fundamentals, and you just do them. And, man, you got to get out. You go through an ambush and guys are wounded. You got to get it. You got to dismount. You got to do your drill to police up the area and pull security and do those basics really, really well. And hey, when they're bad guys, shoot them. And that just became, again, as I remember these things, it seemed in one sense very simple. Not that it wasn't scary, but it seemed all these things really were broken down to simple things on the ground to fix.
So let me ask you, when you look back at, and we're just talking about insurgent right now, things you did right, things that now that you've had 30 years to think about it and you look back on it, things maybe you either did wrong or could have done better.
Yeah. So I think that fundamentally, in one sense, the first thing that we should have done, if I could do it all over again, I would have thought about just moving the entire position back to our initial insertion point. We were in the wrong spot, and I was so focused on getting Blackburn evac, it didn't even occur to me that maybe we could all, bound back and move as a formation, back to where Chalk 4 was supposed to be, and then let Casey Joyce and those guys continue on back to the target. Like, honestly, it never crossed my mind. And, that's always, pardon me, that's always played with me a little bit. Like, were there people that slipped in to affect the target that, if you could picture that, we were supposed to be in a box, 4 positions, were people able to slide in, in the space that was open to them? I'll never know. I obviously I'll never know, but that would have been the first one. As it turned out, not that this had any significance tactically, because we still couldn't move, where our blocking position was inserted. When the first Super 6-4 went down, my guys could look 3 blocks down this alley and see it. They could see the rubble, so it's like, shit, there's where we need to go. We got a bird's eye view of where this Black Hawk has crashed. Unfortunately, there was no cover, no concealment, no way to move down this alley. And we had bad guys, enemy between our position and the crash site. So we were kind of stalemated in a sense. But those two things, one, should I have moved everybody, down to the right blocking position? I didn't. And then second, bearing where we were, could we have moved over to the block? Could we have gotten to the crash site earlier? And I don't think we could have, given the enemy's displacement on the battlefield. So that, again, kind of a stalemate is the answer I get. But that was definitely a big one. Kind of fast forward for a second. Another thing was a convoy moves up to our location, and the battalion commander says, "Hey, we're going to the crash site. Everybody get in." And I'm like, "Sir, the crash site's right over here. This is where we know we need to go there." And he's like, "Yeah, we're driving there, so get in." I've always wondered if, I don't think it was a bad move, of course, to follow the battalion commander's guidance, but it's back to that thing, like, could we have gotten down that alleyway to get to the crash site? And we kicked that around for years, and everybody's like, I just don't know. I really don't know. I don't think so, because, again, you just imagine a narrow alleyway, maybe 20 feet, 15 feet wide, with no places to hide, just walls. And they're a block away. There's bad guys all the way around. And it's like you're walking right into the fatal funnel. There's a good chance, again, this is, woulda, shoulda, coulda, but, there's a good chance, like, nobody could have gotten down that alleyway. So, I'll never know. I'll never know. I think because things were happening so quickly that it seemed very, very reasonable that we could get in those vehicles, go a block, turn right, go 3 blocks, make another right, and we'll be at the crash site. Well, of course, Somalia is not a grid. Mogadishu is not a grid. And, you watch the movie and you see all these things. You can't turn a 5 vehicle convoy, you know, every time there's an alleyway because you just don't fit. So a lot of complexities that at face value seem very simple, but you're like, no, man, you can't turn a deuce and a half, you know, down an alleyway like that. You can't move a Humvee like this. And so, it got us into, that predicament of just trying to find a way to that crash site. And of course, if you know this story, a series of near ambushes, and we just take more and more casualties. And, pretty soon you got more wounded guys than you do fighting force. So it's, what do you do?
Let's move through your emotions. And I want to do an overview of the entire battle because, once again, I know that you've told this story a lot, but I would like to know the emotions you're going through. And kind of a strange question I'd like to ask you, the strangest thing that you remember going through your mind, because I know when people are in critical incidents, some things fly through their mind that you're like, wow, I can't believe I thought about that or I was on that. So can we talk about the range of emotions, kind of how it went throughout the battle, throughout the night, into the next day? And then kind of when you look back on it, go, that's the craziest thought I had.
Yeah. So there's a couple that stick out. Once we got everybody, onto the battalion commander's vehicles, and by now, this is just, I'm the last one getting on. If you remember those old Humvees, they were like more like a station wagon. They had the wooden railings on the back, and all these guys are piled up. And I remember. So check this out, really quick, sort of a funny story to this moment. When I got on the aircraft, before we lifted off, you had those Bose pilot, headsets that the crew chiefs wear, and they've got that green plastic shell. Mm-hmm. And, this is the first time I've worn this shit. And the crew chief, Tamarin Bates, says to me, he's like, whatever you do, make sure you take off the headset and don't pull it out of the helicopter. And I'm like, what are you talking about, man? Like, that's a dumb thing to say. Well, sure enough, when we were going to insert, took the headset off, and I went to put it on the seat. I'm in that little catbird seat between the two crew chiefs. And I went to lay it behind me thinking I was putting it onto the seat, the jump seat. And I go through all this shit, get my gloves on, my iPro brakes, get my helmet on, go and grab the rope, slide all the way down. Don't think anything of it. And so now Colonel McKnight pulls up, and he's like, get everybody on board. I'm getting everybody on. I'm making sure head count, make sure nobody's going. And I'm getting ready to climb on the back of this Humvee. And I remember I was going to step on the tire, and it started to move forward. And I'm like, holy shit, man, they're going to leave without me. And it wasn't like they sped up, but it was the wheels were starting to roll. And everybody's like screaming, stop, stop, stop. And, it does. And I step up on the tire. And as I'm stepping up, I look down, and there's all this smushed green plastic. And sure enough, the headset had got hung up on my canteen. And I ripped that son of a bitch right out of the helicopter, all the way, slid down the rope, pulled the $1,000 Bose headset and everything right out of the roof. And somebody had, of course, run over it. And I remember that just stuck with me, though. I'm like, what's this green plastic shit on the ground in the middle of Mogadishu, doing? And, after we pieced it together, the crew chief told me, he's like, yeah, you sure as shit pulled this thing, right out of the helicopter. And, you owe the government $1,000. But, once I climb up, DJ, and I get, kind of holding on to the wooden railings on the back of that Humvee. And I kind of turned around, I guess, and I fell over backwards, because this thing's going. I'm like, I can't balance myself on this little railing. Anyway, so I'm lying on top of somebody or something. My feet are hanging off the railing, so my feet are exposed. And that was the moment as we started to drive, and I'm hearing all this gunfire, and I'm thinking, I got this body armor and all this shit. I couldn't right myself. I couldn't even get up to fire. And I'm thinking, I'm gonna get shot. Like, I'm gonna get shot. any second. Like I'm done. I'm going to lose a leg. Who knows what's going to happen? But this big kid is getting ready. I'm defenseless, and that really, really was scary. And I say that like that was the moment where I was like, I know what fear is. Like that was one of those. Like I'm just sitting there thinking, just waiting to get hit, and I couldn't move. I was like the turtle on its back, and I don't know. Eventually, we slowed down or stopped or something. I was able to roll over and right myself. But that moment always stuck with me. I'm like, that was maybe one of the scariest moments of my life. Just thinking, like, I don't know if it's going to kill me, but it's going to really probably hurt, and there's nothing I can do about it. That definitely has gone. All these years later, I've always remembered, that moment. And I think the second emotion was when Casey Joyce got shot. Like a lot of guys got shot, and we had gone down this road trying to get to the crash site, wound up in the wrong spot, had gone through an ambush, dismount the vehicle, set up our security, and they're trying to uncork and again, everybody's, as this story, I mean, the helicopter's telling directions and drivers are trying to figure this out, and we were like, all right, we got to turn around and go back. And that's when Sergeant Joyce got shot. And I remember it was, the drill, the sucking chest wound, you've done it instinctively. And I remember, we got his body armor off, and we're behind cover, and those old brown T-shirts, those old Army brown cotton, just like the one I'm wearing, the one you're wearing. We couldn't get it pulled up, to search for the wound, and there were like three of us working on it, and so I was trying to rip his T-shirt. And I couldn't rip, whether it was the neckband or whatever. I just remember I kept trying to rip it, and I couldn't rip it. And I didn't have a knife, or if I had my knife, I didn't think about using it. And I just remember like so frustrated. Like this is just a cotton T-shirt, and this guy's been shot. And come on, this is like ridiculous. Like just figure it out. And finally, I think we ripped it open or pulled it up and found the wound. And we did our drill, but I remember that this isn't the way it's supposed to work. Like, how could something this simple be so difficult? And, we got to the aid and everything, but it was unfortunately, he'd been shot, underneath his armpit, and it could have happened on the front steps of Walter Reed, as the surgeon told me. And sadly, he wouldn't have survived. It was right through his heart. But that feeling of just like trying to rip a T-shirt, I'm like, holy fuck, of all the things during the battle, of all the things we got to deal with, the one thing we can't do is just open up his T-shirt. It was horrible, absolutely horrible. So that emotion of just, this is surreal. Like you can't make this shit up.
What about hopelessness? At any point, do you ever feel that, even for a split second, do you ever feel, holy shit, this is never going to end?
There were, with every ambush we went through, and I think there were two or three, I'm like, you can't make this up. Like, this is just a bad movie. I've said this, it's a bad movie in slow motion. And you think, how many more of these people are there? My gosh, this is insanity. Not us being here insanity, but
right.
Just the status at the moment. You're like, I can't believe it, but you just keep doing, like you got to keep reacting, with each and every drill. And at that point, it's just like, get off, get the wounded, get them on a vehicle, make sure we don't leave anyone behind, and then get back up and start fighting. Like that was just going on and on and on. And there was this moment, I'll tell you, when the decision was made for us to go back to the airfield. At some point, I've been in several vehicles during this whole, battle. Again, always just making sure everybody's off the battlefield. We policed up all our wounded, get them in a vehicle, and we'll kind of sort it out later. And I remember we were in in one of those turtleback Humvees. I guess there was a driver, a TC. I was in the back right seat, and I don't know who was in the back left, and a gunner, in the turret. And I remember, like, this has got to end. Like, this has got to end at some point. This has got to end. I mean, we're driving, batshit crazy going through, and we're passing around a 9mm, a Beretta, because we're all out of ammo. And I remember just thinking, I got the window. They always said, don't put your windows down. Like, at this point, you're like, got the window down. We're shooting. Hey, I got it over here. You pass it over to the other guy, and I just kept thinking, like, you can't make this shit up. Like, you can't make this up. But by the same token, it just seemed normal. Like, yeah, that you do what you got to do. But that was definitely a moment. You're like, when's this shit gonna end?
Let's go to the next day when everything is done. And I've seen this in law enforcement. When you're in a major incident and your body finally that whatever it may be, the first time you drive fast in a police car, the first time you go to a homicide scene, whatever it may be, when your body has time to shut down and all that adrenaline dump is over and everything is done and you just feel sleepy and things like that. When do you realize that you're starting to process it? Maybe not great, but you're starting to process everything that happened.
Yeah, that's a good one, because there is that moment where you just sort of dump it all. Where it just maybe it's a sense of, when we got back to the airfield. They had the triage site set up, and like, there were so many people. We're just pushing them through. And I remember we when we got back to the gate, by this time I don't know what unit it was, but there'd been reinforcements at the gates to the airfield from, could have been 10th Mountain. I wish I knew, but I don't. And I remember as we're screaming up to the gate, we got all these wounded guys. And I just expected that they'd open the gate and pass us through, and we're stopped. And they're fucking around, whoever it is, and doing the right thing. I'm sure. I'm not here to cast stones at anybody, but they weren't opening the gate fast enough. They just weren't. So to me, I got we got guys bleeding out here. So I jump out of the back seat. I run up to whoever was at the gate, and I just start screaming at them, like, open the fucking gate. And they do, and I'm screaming for everybody to follow me. And I remember running, kind of leading the vehicle, whatever it was, 50 yards, 75 yards to the triage site. And I get there, and I'm like screaming at the medics, tell them, hey, trying to tell them who's in the vehicle or what's in the vehicle and all that stuff. That was the first moment where I realized, and I didn't know it at the time, but there was some. And gosh, he was an angel. One of those nurses, I remember, kind of came up to me. He's like, "Hey, what's your name?" And I'm like, Sergeant Eversman. He's like, "No, what's your name?" And I'm like, "Matt." And he's like, "Matt, you got to calm down. You got to calm down. And you're getting everybody. Everybody's going to start feeding off of you." And that, looking back on it, that was that moment you spoke of, DJ, where you're like, emotions, start crying, and then as I remember, as soon as he said that, he's like, "You can't cry, come on," and I was like, okay, just turn it off and go back and, help him with all the, getting the medevacs and all that stuff going. But, in the bigger scheme, when all was said and done, I was so dehydrated. I ached, my body ached. You're pissing fluorescent, just mud, and pardon me, that's kind of gross, but like all of that, just this whole dump it all, and like this. I've never been more exhausted, in my life. And I remember, what do? You go find the commander and give him the status, and I saw the battalion commander, who'd been wounded. I remember he was standing next to me, and he had a Curlex or something around his arm. And, I'm like telling him, he's like, what's his status, and told him. And he very matter of factly, Danny McKnight, to this day, is he's a good man. And he said very nonchalantly, very paternal, he's like, Sergeant Eversman, like, how many men you got? And I'm like, well, there's like 5 with me. And he says, because by this time, one of the convoys had turned around and was already heading out, and we thought we'd get on the next one. And he very matter of factly, he's like, Sergeant Eversman, we don't have anybody in the towers. Like, we don't have any security here. So why don't you get your guys and get them refitted and get them out on the perimeter right now? That would be a good thing. And I'm like, Roger that, sir. So we did, got everybody up, and we had a couple of towers set up, as I remember. And, I just remember, walking into the talk, and it was, eerie in one sense, because now it's night. I'm a chalk leader going in, sort of waiting for the next, the general or, General Garrison or somebody to give me a little more guidance other than I got my guys out on the perimeter. And Colonel Boykin, who was the Delta commander, again, another one of these great men, walked up to me, and, we're looking at the monitor or something. I remember, DJ, and, he looks at me and he says, Sergeant, and I'm like, yes, sir. He goes, is that your blood? And I'm like, kind of like, what do you mean, sir? And, look down, and my trousers, my BDU bottoms were all just dull red. It just all from, all the wounded and all the guys we'd worked on. And I didn't even think about it. I'm like, no, it's not me. And he's like, well, why don't you go change your pants? Or something like that. But it was very calm about it. He's like, just go put on something clean. That would be good. And at that point, you're like, Roger that, or whatever you say. But those moments, emotionally, it's a great topic, because nobody ever told us any of this stuff. Like, hey, there's a lot of emotions that are going to go on when you get in one of these events. At least be prepared for it.
You think we've done better at that now?
Mm-mm. No, I honestly, I don't. I really don't. I think we've tried in one sense, DJ, quite candidly, but I don't think we have. And I think there's a lot of, we're prone to forget some lessons learned at the soldier, emotional level. Because again, you're like, we don't want to talk about emotions. That's not man stuff. That's not warrior stuff. We need to, drive on. Listen, when we, and I do chalk it up to, I think, we do the best we can. The command did the best we can. But when we eventually got back to Fort Benning, after all this shit, and oh, by the way, we almost deployed directly to Haiti from Mogadishu. Like, there was a thought we were going to go and jump into Haiti. They were going to bring chutes and we are going to jump in. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But we get back to Benning, and the answer was, "Hey, man, take a 4-day weekend." Like, that was it. That was it. Take a 4-day weekend. You truly, I didn't know any better. I'm like, well, I guess that's what you do. You come back from war and you take a 4-day weekend and come back to work on Tuesday for PT. It seems silly, but at the time that was kind of it. And it was Casey Joyce's dad, who was a Vietnam veteran also. He'd served with Dave Hackworth, and very distinguished career. And, I met him back at Fort Benning because he, of course, was there for his son, to receive the body and the funeral and everything. And, when I met Colonel Joyce, he asked me this I can remember, Matt, have you had any time to grieve? Have you had any time to process this? And I'm like, well, we had a 4-day weekend. And, his head almost popped off. I mean, he almost, I'm like, I thought the poor guy was just, his head was going to explode. And I don't know if it was because of Colonel Joyce, but really quickly after that, they're like, hey, everybody in Bravo Company, we're taking 2 weeks leave. We're not charging you for it, and, kind of go do your thing. But still, that was 30 years ago. And I can honestly say, I'm not sure we've done much of a better job of taking care of the force while they're serving. That's just my 2 cents. I think we try some things, but I don't know that we've cracked the code, and I don't know why we haven't, because, again, back to that, how much is enough? How much do you do or not do? But, listen, you clearly have experienced it in law enforcement too. There's that fine line between, we still got a job to do and there's a next mission, and somebody's got to do it. Everybody's at war. Everybody's fighting. And, we might have to ask a little more of you. But I don't think that I don't think we have done a great job of taking care of our soldiers emotionally. I don't have a solution to that one, to be candid too, but I don't know that we have.
When do you think you were ready to talk about this? Because let me preface that question by saying what I've heard, and you can confirm whether this is true or not. You were actually the first interview, and it was a voluntold interview for the writing of Black Hawk Down.
That is correct. That I don't have the proof in it, but that was I was walking into the barracks for PT, and the commander met me at the front steps, and he's like, "Sergeant Eversman, be at the conference room at 09 or something like that." I'm like, "All right, Roger that, sir." I can picture being in the conference room, but I didn't remember Mark Bowden from anybody. I'm like, it wasn't until the book came out, and I'm like, who the fuck's this guy? What's this book about? You just do it. But to that point, if I could just for a second, DJ, they early on, and I don't know whether it was just some enterprising young, colonel or somebody at Benning. It's like, hey, let's get some of these Mogadishu guys over to talk, at Building 4, which is, the headquarters for all the officer training and everything. And, let's do a little AAR. And so a bunch of us went over and did that. And then the next thing there was a group of us going up to West Point. And I remember to do the same thing. And, I'm a young staff sergeant. I'm a knucklehead. And, yes, sir, 3 bags full. And I remember I was sitting on the plane leaving Columbus to go to Atlanta to fly up to West Point. I'm sitting there, and this guy that was a couple of rows ahead of me, older gentleman, kept turning around and looking at me. Like, you're looking at me like he knew me. I'm like, what the fuck is this guy looking at? Like, do I owe him money or something? Like, why is this guy he's looking at me, he's smiling and, all that stuff. And we get to Atlanta, that was back in the days where you just sat on the plane and waited for, the change anyway. He comes back, and it turns out this guy was one of the USASOC, the U.S. Army Special Operations Command psychologists. I don't remember if he had been in Mogadishu with us or not. I'm not sure, but somehow he knew who I was. I couldn't remember his name or anything, but he asked me what was going on, and I told him. I'm like, yeah, sir, I'm going up to West Point with a couple of guys, and we're going to go talk about Mogadishu. And this is not long after we've been back. Maybe this is a late fall. And he said words to the effect of, "That's so good for you to go and talk to these kids." And I'm like, yeah, we're passing lessons learned. But he was like, no, this is good for you to talk about it. And the more you talk about it, the better you'll be able to process. And if you're good, tell people everything you can, to however much you feel comfortable. Was his whole deal. Was like, take care of yourself, but the more you can share, the better off it'll be for you. That was kind of the lesson learned. So I'm like, yeah, okay. And, I think that was a tremendous help for me personally. In fact, I know it was being able to talk. That's why when people say, oh, you see the movie, does it trigger anything? I'm like, no, I know the story. And I don't say that callously. I know the good, the bad, and the ugly. I know how it ends. I know what happened. I know the people there, and there's the sadness of it. And there's a lot of emotion again at recounting it, but to be able to talk about it quite candidly with people, I think is important, not only for the listener, but for the guy telling that story.
Well, let me ask you, because you just said that when you first start telling this story, when you first start recounting everything that's happening, it's just a yes, sir. You're kind of checking the block. One, I want to know, has the way you told this story changed? Because that's a very important thing in how you express the story. And then number two to it, when were you really ready to open up about it? Because like you said, when it's a yes, sir, it's one way. When you're really ready to tell the story, it comes out a completely different way. And you can tell the exact same facts and it will come out completely different.
Yeah, no, it is. And that's again, another great commentary. And what I chose to do was flip it, and not to tell, not to make shit up, not to tell a lie, not to spin it, but tell the story in a different perspective. And the different perspective is, listen, people read the book, they know the story, they know what they saw in the news, all that kind of stuff, and people can focus on the lack of air support and the debacle in Mogadishu and all that kind of shit. And I'm like, it's easy to fall into that particular lens. But to me, I was like, people need to know the maybe the positives of it. They need to know about the valor, and they need to know what young 20-year-olds were doing and how well they did it. And if there were things that were mistakes were made, I'll tell them what I did wrong. But I think people, before they make up their minds, ought to hear about a Casey Joyce or a Jim Telscher or a Dave Deemer. And I'm just talking about the guys in my squad, Scott Galentine, that were doing their job so well. And you can get really not excited, but I felt that was important. Listen, people can read the newspaper and say like, oh, Les Aspin, and Bill Clinton did this and that and shit, echelons way above us. But what they really need to hear, though, is how those men accounted for themselves on the battlefield. Like, I think that's the most important. And smarter people can figure out the politics and the great strategies of shit. But they need to know, like, when you're in the throes of a shitty situation, this is what this force did. And this is what they did well. And to this day, I'll look anybody in the eye and say, like, when you call it a failure, I'm like, fuck you. That was not a failure. Strategically, completely changed foreign policy overnight. And that's because lack of resolve at, again, levels way above me. But at the tactical level, mistakes and all, you put people in that shit show and they accounted for themselves against 10,000 armed, enemy. And, it's almost, again, Cofer Black, he's like, this is the hot gates. This is the Battle of Thermopylae. And, and I think the boys accounted for themselves very well, very, very well. And that's what, if we lead with that, we can tell the rest of the story. And you can look people in the eye without looking at your feet and shuffling about mistakes that we made. Like, yeah, of course we made mistakes. Didn't bring my nods. What a jackass. Well, you know what? There's another one, DJ. The old one-quart canteens. You remember those on the old Alice gear? You know what fits well into a one-quart canteen pouch? 7 loaded magazines. It does, and I'm living proof. So I took out. I'm like, I don't need two quarts of water. Who's going to drink water on the battlefield, jackass? But I took that out, 7 magazines, and I'm glad I had them. Then you can talk about that without it being like, oh, the whole battle was fucked because Eversman didn't have his water. It's like, well, that was a mistake. Truly a mistake. But there were some other things that far outshone the actions on the ground of these guys that were doing their best, fighting tooth and nail, in a tough situation. And yeah, lessons learned. But that is my roundabout way of coming to it. I chose not to tell a sad story, but to tell a story that has some sadness in it, but to focus on the amazing things that this group of young men, I don't know if there were any women on the ground that day. I know at one of the, maybe there's some CIA female that was there, but at the time, all male force, like what these young men did. And that's when I'm like, I'd go to battle again with this group. I'd do the same thing, generally speaking, minus, certain things we already talked about, but I'd go back to that fight again with that same group, every day and twice on Sunday.
I'm so glad that you brought up the word failure. And it's so interesting to hear you bring up the word failure, because I've heard you in other interviews and you've written about failure where people say that mission was a failure. I want to point to something else in your career. You were in Iraq for 15 months during the surge, and a lot of people pointed out and they said that was a failure too. And it really made me start thinking about you and posing this question to you. Because I look at it from a law enforcement perspective because we hear it daily from the general public. I think, how fucking dare you tell me something is a failure when you didn't see it happen, when you weren't there, when you don't know the emotions and all the stories that went into it. You're getting a buzzword or a news topic that comes off the TV. How fucking dare you tell me something's a failure? I've got to understand how you deal with that, how you have pushed through that and told the story that you have made sure got out.
Yeah, well, it's hard, and I don't mean that patting myself on the back, because you talk to any of the other guys that were. I saw Brad Thomas was on your show back in the day, and there's this. You just summed it right up, DJ. What the public hears is what the media tell, and I don't mean to go down that whole road, but it's the buzzword stuff. It's very binary. It's easy to say, wow, soldiers died, failure, absolutely failure. I'm like, well, the mission that day was to go after these two, blacklist guys or whatever we called it at the time. And we got them. And oh, by the way, not only did we get those two, but 19 others. And, the reality of combat. And Tom Matthews, who was the 160th commander, I think said it best. He said, Americans have an antiseptic view of war. So that's it. It is squeaky clean. Somebody dies, that's it. And, automatically a failure. And I say that not to conflate the loss of life of troops and to gloss over that, like, soldiers die in combat, it happens all the time. But it is a reality of combat. And most people aren't willing to accept that, you can do everything right. Enemies got to vote. All these things happen, but you still accomplished that mission. It was ugly. It was fucking hard and it was brutal, but we did it and we did it and we accounted for it well. And yeah, so it took a while. It really did, to be kind, because it used to just, it'd be seething, and even people you'd meet randomly, it's like, oh yeah, that you were with that fucked up, Black Hawk Down thing. And I'm like, do you want your teeth kicked in right now or later? When you tell me, man. That just shows the ignorance of the public in some senses. Not all public that hears it, but that whole idea, they don't know. They don't know what it's like to be in Milwaukee when ice cream, pint dishes are filled with cement being thrown at windshields, of a cop sitting on the street trying to stop a riot. They don't know that. They don't hear that. They never hear that guy that's like, I'm standing my ground, but these guys are fucking throwing cement with nails in it at me. You know what I mean? Like that, they don't know that. So we got to tell, back to the original comment, we got to tell these stories. People need to know, the truth. And it's like, hey, man, make your decision later, but wait till you know the facts. Wait till you know what it's really like, to be shot at, what it's really like when these guys are shooting RPGs at you and you've got to make these decisions. Like, again, thankfully, most people will never know what that's like, but they ought to be smart enough intellectually to realize, like, hey, maybe I don't have the entire picture here. But we all go back to, I say we all, at large, we look at the grand scheme politically of how things happen. And, I don't know that it'll ever change.
There's a certain group in the public that no matter what you tell them, you're never going to change their opinion on it. And so I think our efforts are best focused on people that possibly could change their opinion or could want to learn about what happened. But I think it's an interesting dynamic to hear you say it about things that you did in your military career, comparing it to a law enforcement first responder, especially in these past couple of years. What has happened?
Yeah, man. Well, listen, not to be, egregiously a weasel about it, but I spent a year, with James Patterson interviewing law enforcement officers. I mean, literally, I talked to 150 of them. I don't know what the final number was, for this book about law enforcement, walk the blue line. And I say that not to sell books, but what I learned from that very similarly is that people don't know. They don't know. They only know what they're told. And, our law enforcement community gets hamstrung about telling their stories because I don't know why they do, but they're somehow the stories never get out. And, when you hear those stories, certainly firsthand, and then as we wrote, you realize like these men and women, and quite candidly, and I know I say that a lot, quite candidly, but it makes me feel smarter, I guess. But, they're deployed their entire career. There's no, red, amber, green, whatever the fuck we called it, training cycle. Like this is like you graduate, you get your job, you do your ride along with your FTO, and then one day we send you out to do good things for God and country or city, and you're deployed until you retire or until you leave the force. And I don't know that it ever really occurred to me, in one sense, the similarities, but in another sense, the dramatic difference of, like you said, you go on a call, today, and you're the first responder at a crash site, and it's the worst of the worst. There's a fatality of a child, and then you got to go right after that to a call where someone's pissed off at their neighbor, trimming the wrong hedge, and then you've got to go to a domestic, and then you've got to go to this, and then what? Tomorrow you get to do it all over again, and you do that for 10, 15, 20 years. And people don't realize that. I mean, DJ, I'm literally preaching to the choir, but it's sort of like every conversation we've had for the last, however long we've been talking, the law enforcement officers do it day in, day out. And, again, everything we've just talked about, we could flip it right back and say, what are we doing about, law enforcement officers and their mental and emotional well-being? I'm like, you don't see ads in the Super Bowl. And I say this again, in the spirit it's intended. Of course, we got to take care of our wounded soldiers. And of course, we constantly need to be focused on veteran suicide and all the things about the veteran population. Yes, absolutely. That's a no-brainer. But we're not talking about law enforcement. What about them? Why is there's not an ad, on TV that I've seen, talking about the street cop in, Paducah, Kentucky, or Dallas, or Bangor, Maine, what they're dealing with day in, day out for, again, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And I'm like, that's got to change. Like we're you talk about an existential threat. They use that word all the time, to national security. I'm like, well, taking care of a law enforcement officer, our cops, if we don't have them on the job, man, we're fucked.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I've said it a lot on this show. I don't think we're there. I don't think we're even close to there. We like to use a lot of buzzwords, like I've said before. We like to say, yeah, we're worried about your health and we're worried about your mental status. But then you get into the problem of you can speak to who they tell you can speak to or who that insurance will cover instead of doing a wide range of you can go talk to whoever you want, whoever you need to in order to get feelings out or whatever it may be. And so I think we're a long ways from it in this community too.
And just if I could just throw in this too, and again, this is not, it sounds like a backhanded compliment to our military, and it's not if people listen closely. Why don't we as a population, when we see, a policeman or policewoman, why don't we walk up to them and say, thank you for your service? I mean, and I'm not putting you on the spot, DJ. I don't mean it like, to you, but I'm like, why is it culturally? Why don't we do that? Why don't they at the airports, like, if you're a police, if you're a current active duty, serving law enforcement officer that's flying fucking to wherever, and you got to sit in 39B, why don't we say that at least we'll let you get on first? And I mean that sincerely. I would say that to anybody, if it were, a clown, the Clowns Guild interviewing me today, I would say the same thing. It's like, why don't we do that? And we like you said, we got a long way to go. We got to keep chipping away at that because it's important. It matters. Like that's important shit for our communities and for our country and our nation. We gotta figure this shit out like quickly. And I know my language is deteriorating as we go on here, but it's I wish I had a better answer and I wish I could snap my fingers, but we got to keep trying.
Just to kind of tack on to that, I just think it's a cultural stigma. I think that police are there to enforce the law, and when people in the public look at it, they're saying, well, those guys are controlling situations and stuff. So it gets into a whole socio,
Yeah.
political. I mean, it would take us hours to talk about that, but I believe that we're a long ways away from fixing it. And I think we're trying to move in the right direction. Another thing that I wanted to talk to you about was transition, and that gets into the books, the movies, all that kind of stuff. But an interesting point that you said that you were naive when you got out because you thought leadership was just leadership. Why does that make you naive when you get out? And we've talked about that structure in the military that led you. I think you were expecting the same thing when you got out, but it changed a little bit for you.
Yeah, no, it definitely did. And again, I gotta choose my words a little carefully because I don't want to say like there's not good leaders in the civilian community who didn't serve in the military. Like clearly there are. I mean, we all again, when you say clearly there are, that's a sort of an asshole thing to say. But what I realized in short order was a lot of the leadership that I was exposed to when I retired, in the civilian professional community, were very enterprising men and women who had a great idea of a product or a service and were able to very entrepreneurially, build a company to satisfy that objective, of getting this product to the market or getting this service out to the market, and that's to be commended. However, those people, in my experience, generally, they weren't privates, they weren't young lieutenants, and I say that figuratively, like they didn't start at the bottom in most cases. They started at the top. And so their idea of taking care of the troops and the principles of leadership that we learn in the military and in the paramilitary organizations are very, very foreign to them. And that really threw me off because I'm like, why the fuck don't you know that the troops eat first kind of thing? I mean, why don't you understand that we got to give clear, concise, task and purpose for, all these actions that we need to do. You're just throwing shit out there and off you go. And you paste stuff on the wall and that'll, something about motivation and that'll wear off on itself. It's like, no, you got to be, the leader needs to be in there, be no do, to use Army terminology, to be better. And you realize like, no, they don't. And listen, as a transitioning 40-year-old, everyone says like, Matt, nobody wants a first sergeant. Nobody wants a first sergeant. Nobody wants a ranger. Nobody cares about how many push-ups you can do and blah, blah, blah. You got to learn everything new. And I'm like, oh, okay, because I need a job and I'll do it. And then, for a few months, I'm sitting on my hands watching, this stuff happen that I'm like, this is, Lance Corporal level stuff. This is not hard. Hey, before we're going to go to make a pitch to a potential client, maybe we ought to rehearse it. Like, wouldn't that be a good idea? Maybe we should do that. Or, well, so-and-so is only 25. They couldn't, they're not mature enough to do, A, B, or C. I'm like, fucker, man, I've seen 25-year-olds making strategic decisions on the battlefield under fire, and they did it quite well. Because they were trained and they were taught. And so that all kind of gets into this mix of, that idea of like, man, there shouldn't be, but at a time I went through this thing like, man, there must be a different style of leader. There's a different kind of leader, all this stuff. Eventually what you realize is like, no, people are people. We're in the people business, and how we take care of our people, to get the best out of them, that's leadership. And if I could be, distill it that much, it's like we gotta take care of our guys and gals, or they're not going to produce. Which gets back to, who are you going to follow down the alley? The asshole that doesn't give a shit about me, or the guy or gal that like truly is invested in me? And it's really quite simple. That's the best I can give you.
Let's talk about these books and this new career that you've kind of done. You've done a documentary where you were also in a Black Hawk when you flew back to Afghanistan, and I hear that alarms went off in that helicopter, that you were being targeted from the ground. So I'm sure that brought up numerous memories. But let's talk about how you came up with these books, how you came up with this movie, Send Me, and kind of what you're doing now with life.
Yeah. So the short answer is, and this took a long time to kind of figure out, because we get very one track mind. We leave the service, we've got to have another career that we're going to do for another 20 years, and that's that. And you realize like that's kind of industrial age thinking. And I had 3 jobs. Again, lovely people, very kind. I'm grateful they gave me an opportunity, but I was just chasing money, to keep the lights on. And none of those jobs, as I look back, I should have taken, because, I either didn't like the product, I didn't like the people, or I didn't understand the market. And, eventually I realized like, man, I just need to take a little break before I figure out my next, adventure. And my wife said, well, listen, before you get another job, let's sort of take a knee, drink some water, and maybe you could do a little consulting. I'm like, yeah, okay. And this all spills out. Long story, not so long. Luck and opportunity, truly, and that is the tagline: luck and opportunity, and maybe not always in that order. But when you realize if you take your rear sight, open up that rear sight aperture, and take the blinders off, you realize that you never know what's sitting around the corner. And I moved to South Florida. I was invited. We moved down here to West Palm Beach, didn't know anybody, and I met a guy literally at a coffee shop one day, just chatting, and turns out his son was in Second Ranger Battalion, and we caught it up. And he says, "Hey, they've got this. Fisher House is having a fundraiser, on Palm Beach, on the island of Palm Beach. All the millionaires and billionaires are going to be there. You should go." I'm like, fish out of water. But he's like, yeah, I'll call you. I'll see if I can get you in, and you can go. And so I did, and because it's a Fisher House, and we should take care of that. And my wife and I walk in, and this swanky restaurant on Palm Beach, and gentleman's there, and he's like, "Hey, Matt, I want to introduce you to the director of the local Fisher House." I promise this is a long story. I'll make it short. The long story is, the director of the Fisher House comes up to me, and she's like, "Oh, Matt, I'm so glad to meet you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your service. Would you mind speaking a few words, to the group here about our fundraiser?" And what are you going to do? Say no? I'm like, yeah, no, okay, cool. So get up and talk a little bit about, the need of the Fisher House. And afterwards, this gentleman, walks up to me, and he says, introduce himself, and he says, "Hey, I'm a reporter. I've been a journalist all my life. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan a dozen times since the beginning of war, and I'd like to take you to Afghanistan, and maybe we could do like a documentary." And I'm like, "What the fuck are you talking about, man? Like, truly, like, what do you mean?" Like, I'm like, "Yeah, whatever." And to his credit, for 6 months he would email me and text me, and I ran out of excuses, and so I finally met with him, and turned out to be a really good guy. And anyway, long story, not so long. He puts it together, and we decide that we're going to go to Afghanistan, and we're going to do a short documentary for PBS about battlefield medicine. And we kicked this around for a long time. Like, we could maybe compare where we are in 2018 to where we were in 1993, because that's something I could legitimately look somebody in the eye and talk about. And so we did. And lo and behold, doggone if this thing didn't win an Emmy Award. I mean, it's a 20-minute documentary, wins an Emmy Award. They're still showing it on PBS, around the country, which is amazing. Well, James Patterson is a friend of Tim Malloy, and Tim's the guy who put this all together. James Patterson calls me up one day and introduces. I answer the phone, I'm like, hey, this is Matt. And he's like, Matt, James Patterson. You're like, General's calling. And he says, he's like, I'm thinking. He's like, I saw the documentary, and Jim lives down here. I mean, he is local. He lives in Palm Beach, and Jim says, I think we should do a book about kind of the post 9/11 veterans. He said, because my dad was in World War II and he never talked about it, and here we are in 2019. He's like, it's below the fold. He's like, and they won't talk to me like they'll talk to you. He's like, I saw you on that documentary. You're a soldier and you talk to soldiers and they'll talk to you. And he's like, let's write a book. Let's what do you think about that? And you're like, well, best-selling author in the world asks you if you want to collaborate with him. Totally outside of my bandwidth. All the thing is like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? But I said yes. I'm like, let's give it a shot. That's sort of where it all started, DJ. And we did that book, Walk in My Combat Boots, and again, God bless. It was a great success. Did well it made number one on the New York Times, and I thought it was a one and done deal. And then he called me up and he's like, hey Matt, what do you think about maybe we could do a story about emergency room nurses? And this literally, we talked about it before COVID started. So earnestly, we kind of started on the front end of COVID, but it's just kept going, and we got a good team, we got a good process, and I get to do these interviews with these fantastic, amazing, servants, and I say that selfless servants to our communities, and Jim works the magic after that, and it is it's so unbelievably fulfilling, DJ. That's all I can say. Never in a million years. If you'd asked me 30 years ago, standing on the corner of Hawaladig Road in Mogadishu, in a gunfight, if you could time out right here, Matt, what do you think you're going to be doing in 30 years? You're like, selling ice cream. I mean, who knows? I'll be a garbage man or something. No offense to ice cream salesmen or garbage men, but, this just happened. And, I mean that I'm sure everybody and their brother's not going to get a chance to work with a guy like James Patterson, but I do know that once that mindset of mine opened, so many opportunities do present themselves to things you would never normally say yes to. And I think therein is the rub. Don't be afraid to say yes to things that somebody offers up to you just because you don't think you can do it. They see something in you. It might not work, but there's a really good chance it could work because they're experts. So don't be afraid to say yes. And that's what I've been doing these days. And it's a magnificent. I'm blessed beyond, all things to get to have a front row seat at a master class with one of the best authors in the world.
You look back on your entire career, wrapping this up. Anything you regret? Anything you wish you would have changed?
Ooh, that is the $1 million fastball. And there's a lot of things I wish would have gone differently when I look back on my military career. For instance, trying out for a special mission unit and not making it, which was bone crushing. Absolutely, what a failure. That's horrible. All these things. And, you can go down the litany of things that didn't go the way that they did and you wish they did. But when I sit here, on September 19th, 2023, talking to you to answer that question, and I think, had any of those at the moment events that were so important to me have turned out the way they should have, I wouldn't be having this discussion. And my wife and I joke about it all the time. She's like, if you'd have made it to that unit, we'd never have met. And I know it sounds sort of Lifetime movie-like, but we wouldn't have met. The chances are really, really, we wouldn't have met. And, our daughter, Molly, who's thriving in Raleigh at NC State is, like you can just sort of see how those dominoes fall. And so I don't think about it that much of like what I could have, would have, should have. I mean, I wish I would have invested like fucking in Google, or bought some Bitcoin for, $50. When I thought about this, I talked to this guy, when I got back from Iraq in 2008, real quick, true story. I had been reading, a friend of mine would get his wife would send him the Wall Street Journal while we were deployed, so from all of '06 through all of '07. And, every couple of weeks I'd read the Wall Street Journal. Don't understand it, but I'm reading it because it's something to read. I'm reading all about this cryptocurrency and this thing called Bitcoin. So retire, we moved back to Baltimore, and we'd only been there, a couple of months, early 2008. And my wife's from Baltimore, and we went to a high school reunion of hers. And it turned out that the husbands of this group were all finance guys, all bankers. And I remember asking them, like, hey, what do you think about this Bitcoin? And they're like, it's bullshit. Don't do anything like that. And, I think at the time Bitcoin was going for like, 2 pennies, and I'm like, do that math. I mean, $100, when it went to 30 grand, you're like, that would have been a good thing to do, buying some Google stock, buying some Microsoft. But I say that jokingly. I think at the end, though, truly, I don't know that I would have done anything differently. I'm glad I didn't, because this is the way life, good Lord had a plan. Go back to all the tactical stuff and, oh man, I hope I treated people well. When you hear from soldiers, 10, 15 years later, and you're like, man, I hope I did that guy right. I hope I did. And, keep my fingers crossed. But no, I generally am trying to always keep, face forward, look forward, and be grateful. I mean, we got to have an attitude of gratitude. That is cliche, but it is true.
All right. Where can people find you? If they want to look into you some more, they want to hear some more of these stories, they want to get these books, other than on the episode page where you'll be at, where all the links will be, where can people find you?
Yeah, well, I do for some reason have a LinkedIn profile. I don't know why, but I do. And I got off social media, before COVID because it was just annoying me. But, for the books, and I'm not trying to be coy and cute about that, DJ. I'm like, listen, I don't need to be, listening to everybody's politics. So that's sort of the short answer why I got off it. But, you can find me on LinkedIn. For sure, and I'll answer everybody that says hello, for sure. And all the books. I mean, you can go to Amazon, but preferably you go to your local bookstore and support those guys and gals because they're trying to make a buck, and we need them too. So I'm easy to find. If you don't got to try too hard, but just take a Google and you'll find me.
Matt, I'm so glad that you came on here to hear your side of the story. It was simply amazing. I was so looking forward to talking to you. But everybody knows where they can find Matt. Let's talk about where you can find me and kind of wrap this whole thing up. You can find me on social media at Instagram at the DTD_podcast. You can find me on Facebook at the DTD podcast. And you can find me on YouTube, where all these conversations, they're in video form, at the DTD podcast. But your one-stop shop, it's going to be dtdpodcast.net. That's going to be the website that has all the shows. It's got audio, it's video. Matt's got his own page. It's got all of the links to the books. It's got extra pictures of him. And you get to look at a little more of this story. Now that we've known everywhere we can find me, let's talk about my amazing sponsors, the guys that makes this show happen. Mac Belts and Police Coffee. We all know that nothing stands up to wear and tear like a good leather belt. If you're looking for the toughest leather belt on earth, then you've come to the right place. Mac Belts, they're handcrafted in the USA by veterans who are serious about their craft. If you're looking for a belt that's tough enough for your active lifestyle and helps support those who've given so much to our country, look no further than Mac Belts. It's the toughest belt on the planet. They're hand-cut, veg-tan, full-grain saddle leather dyed to a classic saddle tan by veterans and designed by a former Special Forces operator. My friend Mac Alexander over there was a Navy SEAL. Now he makes the toughest belts on the planet. And let's talk about coffee. Police Coffee. It's an officer-owned business. It's dedicated to crafting the finest coffees and blends, and they're shipped as soon as they're made to provide you with the freshest coffee available. Each batch is roasted fresh by people who know what it means to stay vigilant, and their specialty coffees do not waste one drop when flavor is concerned. But let's talk about the most important cause. They give back to our community. 50% of their profits go towards helping family members of police officers who fell in the line of duty. And if you want to talk about flavor, let's talk about One Ranger. It's the newest flavored coffee that you're sure to love. It's flavorful, medium-bodied coffee with a smooth and sweet pecan flavor. Pecan coffee, it's probably one of the best combinations in the world. It's rich, sweet, nutty, and buttery. Its flavor cuts right through coffee's natural acidity to give you a smooth and satisfying coffee experience. Make sure you go to policecoffee.com. They have K-Cups, full bean. They have ground bean. They have treats for your dogs. They have coffee mugs, anything that you need to do coffee. Policecoffee.com and DJ K10 will get you 10% off your order. Don't forget to swing by Mac Belts. Order your Mac Belt, the toughest belt on earth. Guys, that's going to be it for this week. Matt, thank you so much again for coming on the show. Guys, make sure you check us out on the next episode. We're out of here. See you later.